I feel you. I'm right there with you. Hi there. I'm Rachel Nabors. Wanted to talk with you today about how I spent my pandemic, i.e. the react.dev story. I am a former React core member, head of developer once at AWS, developer education at AWS Amplify, Microsoft Edge mascot, and unasked for web animations evangelist, but not in that order. And currently, I am leading developer education at Clerk. I love teaching. Question, how many people in the audience have heard of Clerk before? Put your little hand up. All right, how many people are using Clerk? OK, I like you, sir. We are getting drinks together. It's a lovely authentication solution, but we're not here to talk about that. I just had to get some numbers for my trip report. All right, so long ago, before I ever worked on the React core team, I noticed that React was hard to learn, even for experienced folk. I would talk with people who had computer science degrees, and they said that it was difficult for them to make it through the boilerplate of getting started. And I was thinking, well, if React were as easy to learn as Vue, I'm a huge Vue fan, maybe more people like me would be in the React community. And when I was looking for a job, I noticed that all the six-figure industry jobs required React knowledge. And I saw people like me getting into Vue and Ember, and I was like, that seems like an anti-pattern. If we're all not into React, that kind of limits our potential in our lifetime. That seems like something that I could push against. So I joined the React team in London in 2019 as a developer advocate documentation engineer hybrid. Pro tip, if you're joining a gigantic company, don't take a hybrid role. It just doesn't work. They have all these templates for careers, and if you don't fit right into them, somebody comes by with a chainsaw and ensures that you do. So that's my pro tip. You can thank me for it later when you've got a FANG job of your own. So what I wanted to do was I wanted to democratize React education so that anybody, anywhere in the world could have an exemplary education in React and could go toe-to-toe with Kent C. Dodds. I thought it would have a huge impact, so I spent my pandemic building this baby, the new React documentation, with a few friends from the React community. Now, hands up, how many of you go to react.dev? I want to know where the heck the rest of you are going. but I'll send out a survey another time. All right, thank you. We built react.dev for yourselves. But before I could work on React, I had a different task. The React Native team was like, you got to prove yourself on the React Native docs. And I was like, oh my god, I got to spin all this straw into gold, if you're familiar with the Rumpelstiltskin fairy tale. So I did what I'd been trained to do as a community founder with the web animation community. I realized that the React Native community is a mobile development community. It's not a web development community, for the most part. And I didn't know anything about these people. I'd never built a mobile app before. So I asked them, what do you want? I interviewed them. I sent them surveys on our Twitter. And they told me. They straight up told me. They said, we don't know a lot about React. Your docs just say, if you know React, React Native is like React, but for your mobile device. And that, I had to go to the React docs. And the React docs were like, we use JavaScript. And then I had to go to MDN's docs. And MDN's docs were like, here, this is how JavaScript works. And then I had to read the good parts. And can I go back to Swift UI? I can't blame them. They also said they wanted more visual content. When I say visual content, I don't mean they wanted pretty pictures of apps. I mean they wanted like pictures of what the component was supposed to look like in their app. They wanted to see it before they believed it, and I don't blame them. They also wanted more in-depth content on a select list of specialized topics like security that they wanted to get some professional advice on. They also wanted, and this is really table stakes for documentation, up-to-date component and API documentation. Believe it or not, if you really wanted to know the most up-to-date information about how the components or the APIs worked, you're best served by going to the source code. A lot of people were going to the source code of React Native rather than the documentation. That's a smell. And lastly, interactive code examples. Because has anyone here ever had a developer environment for Android or iOS running on their machine? You know it would be much better if you could just see it in the browser and be like, OK, yeah, that's what it's going to look like. I got it. All right. It's a lot easier than spinning that up again. So I also ran some surveys and learned some surprising facts. For instance, did you know that 41% of React Native developers come from a mobile background? Straight up. We thought that they were all coming from a web background. Not true at all. In fact, there's this really sad number of 10% of people where React Native was their first experience with programming. I'm so sorry for those people because our documentation was not designed for people without a programming background at that time. Wow. So we did a couple of things differently. And by we, I mean me. Built-in literal context switchers to speak to everyone's unique background. People with Android are using different sets of primitives from people on web. We can't make assumptions about the metaphors that people are going to understand. Added this lovely React refresher, which assumes no knowledge about React and sort of ramps people into the React paradigm if they've never seen it before, and added these handy interactive sandboxes courtesy of our pals at Expo. Now, because the docs were not built from source, I had to run a little bit of a docathon with the community where we all went out, combed through the source codes, and updated those API docs. That was a pretty good idea. And brought in experts from the community, such as guest writers, to patch up the missing documentation and add colorful illustrations that turned out to be quite popular. So react.native.dev launched on July 23rd, 2020. And the reboot lifted its documentation's thumbs up to thumbs down ratio 70%. This whole effort took about 6 months total. It was ongoing. It didn't have one big launch. It rolled out many different things in succession. But that's a pretty big lift in terms of customer satisfaction, or developer satisfaction, as it were. And that set the bar for what we were going to do next with react.dev. All right, so now that I'd proven myself, it's time to let me at the core, engineers. Yes. Kicked off on May 27th, 2020. You can even see my totally okay and not too intimate diary entry that says kicked off React Edu Materials reboot from that exact day. It's from my Kurzgesagt gratitude journal. I love it. Anyway, so this was how I kicked off the pandemic. Yay. Like with React Native, started with the community. I don't know if you remember this little community survey going out. There was an animated GIF. You may have seen it on Twitter. Asked people to fill out some simple survey questions. Learned that basically people didn't hate hooks. That was great. Loved that. Everyone on the team was like, do they like it? We don't know. We can't see. And it's like, survey results say people don't hate it. But interestingly enough, more women than men still work with class components, implying to me that there's a gender imbalance in who's working on greenfield projects and who's maintaining the brownfield projects. But we don't have time to dive into that. What did they say? Exactly the same thing, sort of, as the React Native developer community said, except with a few additional bits. For instance, components should be taught from a functional perspective as opposed to the class perspective. When you originally visited reactjs.org, the old stinky site, it's taught everything as React was conceived with classes. This was dreadfully confusing for people learning React because they'd be like, what am I supposed to be learning? They didn't dive all the way into the corner several folders away where the hooks documentation was. So yes, and there needed to be a better hooks reference. I think useref was documented in 3 different pages, and you really had to dig to figure out what dependencies were. No good. More visual content. Everybody loves visual content. Come on. And of course, interactive code. They were getting jealous of the React Native developers. And especially if you go out and you see some of these excellent educational courses about how to learn to code online. I mean, View School is one of them. You'll see that the code is interactive. Now, this was not something people did in documentation for the most part back at this time. This was something that most doc sites didn't do. They'd show you flat code, pictures of code, very funny stories I can tell you over drinks about that. So we kicked off the project under appropriate lockdown guidelines. At my apartment in London, it started as this cool doodles and lots of, there were pizzas involved, and anyway, yeah, we did a card sort. Dan Abramov and I tended to communicate in sketches, and this helped me make a new friend during the pandemic who I like to call React Head. Now, I started doodling this little guy, kind of inspired by IKEA furniture. I'd moved into my apartment, so I was well familiar with this character. And yeah, he's like the React logo on a body. But this really made it easy to start talking about things and anthropomorphizing them with the team and kind of summing what I was learning up with Dan. And of course, Dan's response would always be like, not quite, Rachel, not quite. This is Dan's response in many situations. We often ended up describing React using a waiter metaphor. In this case, we've got the components kitchen and the user being the order, sending things back and forth to the kitchen to rebake them, or render them, as it were. And I used this to create visual metaphors about what I was learning to kind of finalize them with the team to make sure we were getting the metaphors right to teach the audience. So it's a very long process. This is a spreadsheet of all the new content that went into the react.dev site. It was like writing a new book. And some people did ask, why did it take so long? Because it was writing a new book. We were teaching React with a new paradigm. And the team really believed that the old content was not sufficient, that auditing the old content would not take it to that level. And I gotta say, I agree. The new content is far superior. But writing a book takes about a year or so. So we did go to beta December 8th, 2020, which was announced in a little React Docs keynote, the only keynote I have given at a official React conference. So I'm going to use this slide in every talk I ever give forever in the future. I'm so proud. And it launched with those illustrations. Woo! Yeah. And a diagramming system by Maggie Appleton. I did many diagrams. The React team could not read them. So we brought Maggie in to create a system that people could read. I'm really grateful for her interpretations of my chicken scratchings. And of course, Code Sandbox. By the way, shout out to Code Sandbox. Our lovely MC is from Code Sandbox. It's a wonderful company that creates the very syntax upon which these interactive examples were based. Real game changer. When people first saw these, there were a few different, they didn't have the numbers down the side, and when you hovered over it, the cursor didn't change. They wouldn't interact with them because they thought that it was a picture of code or just another uninteractive code block. And we went back and forth with iterations to get it just right so it looked like an editor. And then when people would hover, they'd be like, wait, my cursor changed. Hold on. And then a moment later, they'd be like, oh my God, is it changing? Is it updating in real life? And I'd be like, yes, it totally is. But I couldn't lead them. I couldn't be like, why don't you try playing with that sandbox? I was just kind of like standing over their shoulder, watching them, sweating, from afar in a user test. Like, are they going to click it? Are they going to click it? But this was really, really, really smoothed out. Love to the Code Sandbox team. I hear someone else is a huge fan over there. All right, so how did we make it stick? React isn't a very easy paradigm to get, depending on your background. I mean, I tried to learn it many times. One of the reasons I took on the job was because it just wasn't sticking for me. I don't know how many times I started one of those courses, got bogged down in setting up Webpack, and then couldn't remember any of the other lessons. All I remembered was that Webpack sucks. No, it doesn't suck. It's very great. But if I'm just trying to make a to-do list and I'm spending all my time on Webpack, there is something wrong. There is something wrong with that. So how do we make it stick? Studies show that cramming doesn't work. What makes knowledge stick is, by the way, there is this book called Make It Stick. I'm going to save you reading the book. It's a great book, but essentially what it says is practice that's been spaced out, interleaved with other learning, and has been varied, produces better mastery, longer retention, and more versatility. Essentially on-the-job training, or quizzes. Your teacher runs up to you and is like, what's 5 times 5? And then you have to immediately, whoa, hang on, you don't have Google, you have to just kind of spin it. And if you're wrong, your body gives you a little cortisol, a little anxiety. If you're right, you get a little dopamine. Nature at work. It's an amazing lesson. But yeah, you could just read all the React documentation before an interview. You probably should. The little challenges at the end are a great interview prep. But what's probably better is if you do quizzes throughout the week. Do a leak code every day with a friend rather than trying to cram leak code 1 week before your big FANG interview. You're not going to remember any of that stuff in a month. But if you're spacing it out, kind of like Duolingo, doing a little bit every day, doing a quiz, being unprepared, coming in, it's going to stick longer. So how are we going to recreate this retrieval practice on the docs? We use the sandboxes. The sandboxes let us ship things called challenges, which really made the difference. These were sort of like what people were using in courseware, which is where there'd be some broken code, and you'd fix it, and it let you go to the next episode. But we didn't want to prevent people from advancing. That's actually that's a very linear learning mechanism, and people are landing on docks left and right. We never know where they're going to be, and we can't tell them, no, you don't get to learn about use state until you're done with state. I mean, until you're done with, well, you don't get to learn about use effect until you're done with use state. We don't get to say that. We don't know when they're going to be coming to the docks. We can't control that. So we're like, if you want, you can do these challenges. We got some hints. They're common gotchas. And in testing, most people wanted to do all of the challenges. They're like, no, I haven't got it right yet. Dan will judge me if I don't get it right. And that was delightful to see because it really helped make the lessons stick, to practice them at the end of each one. But how did we know if any of this is working? Well, once again, we ask real people. The best people to tell you if stuff is working is the people you built it for. And we did a spare season of alpha testing where users were 3 times more likely in the after survey to recommend the new React documentation than they were the old React documentation. That was a pretty good signal. So, March 16th, 2023, the docs were declared mission complete. The tutorial was added, the API references were complete, and it was officially launched to the rest of the world, and you have it now. Now, classes, folks, I understand some of you are still maintaining classes, and you're like, where am I going to find all that reference material? Well, you still get React Classic. It's now at legacy.reactjs.org, and it's not going to go anywhere, and it's going to be updated very little, so you can trust that that same content that you learn classes on is going to be available forever and ever and ever and ever. All right. And this is the brand new shiny react.dev. It comes in 2 colors. You're welcome if you like light React Dev or you like dark React Dev, depending on your viewing preference. Since the docs, these docs also shipped with over 600 interactive examples. That includes the challenges as well as what's in the docs itself. So you can practice to your heart's content. All right, I think I've taken up enough of your time, but the illustrations, the interactive sandboxes, and the other things that we trialed in React Native's docs, React Native's docs went on to change how we approached react.dev itself. So in this way, the 2 communities ended up learning from each other and benefiting one another. 8 million users had